So for those of you who have been coming to NationBuilder's webinar sessions over the past kind of year or so, you will know me very well. So I won't bore you with a tedious introduction of my NationBuilder journey, but I will share with you some specifics around why I am here today and why I'm able to deliver this content. So I have been in the US now for nearly 10 years, and I moved out here and got my start in political campaigns here in Massachusetts, where I am currently living. And I've kind of found a family in the Democratic Party, and I worked on mayoral races, city council races, gubernatorials, attorney general, all the way through presidential. And I found myself yearning to try and understand why, in working with the Democratic Party, I had demonized the other side of the aisle, right? This like concept of they're the other. And I found myself at NationBuilder 6 years ago trying to answer that question, because NationBuilder, and we'll talk about this a little bit as we get through, we are here to serve all communities, regardless of political affiliation. The infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that we provide is actually really important that everyone has access to it. And so in my journey to NationBuilder, I actually found myself in relationship with Jay Godfrey, who is our other co-host today, in talking through our differing beliefs as it pertained to Democrat and Republican. And I kind of caught myself in stop demonizing other people who are from the other side of the aisle. There is a conversation to be had, and the infrastructure and access to running for office should be available to all. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jay to introduce himself.
Just want to note, I just caught in the chat that we have somebody joining from Estonia. Love that. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us. That's awesome. As Sorcha said, I am Jay Godfrey. I'm the VP of Customer Success at NationBuilder. And yeah, my journey here was sort of the opposite track of Sorcha's. I worked in Republican politics prior to joining NationBuilder's team. And prior to that, I worked in DC for a few years in the trade association advocacy space. And those experiences were really important and formative for me. But I think the thing I came away from that clear on was that the thing I'm really passionate about isn't partisan politics. It is the political process. It's democracy and people's ability to run for office and participate and make change. And NationBuilder presented as a really young company at the time I joined, which was 2013, a really exciting opportunity to be more directly in the thick of that. And I've been here ever since, growing up with the company and working with Sorcha for most of that. So let's talk briefly about what NationBuilder is all about here. I think regardless of your political leanings, most people would agree we're at a moment that the world is facing real challenges and big challenges. Many of them don't have simple answers. And the thing we truly believe at NationBuilder is that the answer to that is more and better leaders and leadership in the world. It isn't just about one person. It isn't even about a few people. It is about millions of people in large and small ways stepping up and taking responsibility and ownership of solving the world's problems. The reason we build and sell NationBuilder to folks is because we want to provide the infrastructure that makes it possible for anyone to mobilize their community, lead them to action, and become a leader. So what are we? We are an operating system for leadership and for organizing, fully integrated software that ties together a whole bunch of the core components that go into not just political campaigning, though obviously that's what we're talking about today, but movement building in general. That is being able to engage and understand your people. That is being able to maintain a professional web presence. That is communication, email and text blasting. That is donations, fundraising, and a whole host of other things all tied into one package.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. So what we're going to cover, we are going to look at run for office, specifically how to discover the offices that you're eligible to run for in the US. We're going to touch on a couple of case studies of customers that have kind of used NationBuilder's platform to run and win their campaigns or kickstart something for them. We're then going to go into the campaign arc. And so this is including all of your pre-campaign work all the way through to launch, and then what you should actually be doing on election day. And lastly is that infrastructure component. So what are the digital tools? What are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? Wrapping it out with a Q&A. So some political jargon just for newer folks on the call today. A couple GOTV, so that stands for Get Out the Vote. That is the period where your efforts are aimed at increasing voter turnout in your election. Your precinct. So a precinct is the area in which someone votes, and it is the smallest geographic boundary in US electoral politics. District. So your district is everyone who has that same representative. E-Day stands for Election Day. Your voter roll is a list of all of the voters that you are going to be trying to engage to identify support for you. And last but not least is turf cutting. That is a method that you can use to actually contact your voters when you are out in the field. You're going to hear us throw these words around today throughout the webinar. So please, if we are saying something political jargony that you are not sure about, ask the question, because I bet you 10 other people in the room also have the same question. So please pop it into the chat. So Run for Office, we are going to run through what the Run for Office platform is, why NationBuilder actually designed it and created it to increase that mission, that vision that Jay just outlined in our theory of change. So Jay, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah. I talked a moment ago about how we believe that the problems of the world require millions upon millions of leaders. Running for office isn't the only way of leading, but it's a really important one. And I think it's daunting for a lot of folks because people don't know where to start. It feels like the barriers to doing it are insurmountable. We are here today to tell you it is not true. If you know in your gut that you have something important and meaningful to contribute to the world, and you just don't know where to get started, or you're on the fence about whether you want to throw your head into the ring, you should do it. And we are hoping that today we will be able to give you the information you need to get started so that you can come away clear and excited about doing that.
So this all starts with discovery. And first things first, you actually need to figure out what leadership positions are you eligible to run for.
So we built Run for Office, and fundamentally what it is a free database that is designed to demystify a lot of this and make the information on what offices you can run for more readily available to folks. So this is a database that doesn't just surface the offices down to the very, very nitty-gritty local level all across the United States, but also the deadlines to file to run for them, the election dates, the process that you need to go through to file for those offices. And then NationBuilder also provides access to free voter data for the district you're running in to any registered candidate.
Yeah. And so why did we do this? We created Run for Office to demystify it, right? And so what you're seeing here on the right-hand side is that interface. It's really easy to use. It will always be free. It is there as a tool for the public to use. You pop in your zip code and you're going to get that listing, right? What offices can I run for? Where do I do it? Where is the location where I have to file those papers? The whole premise here is that we're making it as easy as possible to get that information, to increase the pipeline of candidates and diversify the pipeline of candidates. It doesn't have to be political party infrastructures that run elections. It can be anyone. We can't just do this by ourselves. We are not able to, right? It is very similar with running a campaign. You need help. And so our partners, you're seeing just a couple of these listed off here, are amazing, amazing organizations that help folks, in particular, looking at folks who are traditionally underrepresented in elected office and equipping them. So think of training, think of helping with digital advertising, making sure that folks know how to get their message out. What does it mean to actually do voter contact and budgeting and finances? All things that Jay and I are going to talk about today, but our partners really are what make our Run for Office program. So if you are, considering a run, please go to runforoffice.org, type in your zip code and see what offices you are eligible to run for. So in the rest of this webinar, we're going to cover the foundations you're going to need to win. So up first, we've got establishing a win number. Then we're going to go into learning about your district and your supporters, and then launching your campaign.
So we're going to talk a bit about some folks who have used NationBuilder successfully to run upstart campaigns. And we picked these campaigns in particular because we think they're representative stories of the kinds of things that are possible. But again, to reiterate, we serve all communities. We've had folks of all partisan stripes use NationBuilder to run for offices, both small and much larger in scope. So this is just a sampling.
Awesome. So up first is Randall Woodfin, and I was really fortunate to actually work directly with Randall's team back in 2016, where he ran for mayor of Birmingham, Alabama. And I worked with Randall's team to implement their full campaign plan into the NationBuilder software. Randall and his team were absolutely not what you would expect when you think of a political campaign running for mayor, right? It was not your, DC political operatives. It was like his campaign manager was a local artist. His staff were all from the community, baristas, like local people who actually deeply cared about what Randall was doing. And so what that led to was a historic race. He beat the 7-year incumbent. Then Randall, 36 years old at the time, was not a candidate that people thought could actually do it. But he went ahead and made history, becoming the youngest mayor in more than a century of the city's history, and ultimately inspired 11,500 first-time voters to turn out in a municipal election.
I think most folks at this point have heard of Andrew Yang, but at the time that he started working with NationBuilder, that was far from the case. He was running in the 2020 presidential primary as an outsider, an entrepreneur who really didn't have much of a footing at all in the Democratic political firmament. And his only edge really was that he was starting early. So if you can rewind your brain to 2019, before you had any idea who this guy was, the media called him a longer than long shot candidate. And in fact, the Washington Post published an article that literally was entitled, "Random Man Runs for President." That's what they said about him, and that's representative of the tenor at the time. So what he focused on was cultivating an online following into a political movement. He had a campaign that was largely not made up of people with a background in politics. They were just people who were passionate about him as an entrepreneur and a universal basic income activist. And NationBuilder was certainly not the only component of this, but it was a core piece of how he equipped Yang Gang activists to organize online at a local level all across the United States. Of course, that ultimately turned into traction for surpassing the individual donor threshold and the polling threshold to make the first 2 debates. Obviously, he did not win the election, but he came out of it as a national figure and left a major policy imprint in both universal basic income activism and his data dividend project. And of course, I think most folks know now he's running for mayor of New York City and is considered either among or potentially the front runner in that race, all built from scratch on the power of just cultivating activists and building community.
Awesome. Okay, so throughout today's session, we are going to be referencing our hypothetical candidate, which is Sally, and she is going to be running for mayor of Quincy, Massachusetts, which happens to be where I am living. And so when we get into this, we will start to kind of ground the conversation in Sally's run so that we can kind of make it more believable as we run through the specifics of what you need. So up first is the campaign arc. So these are the beats. This is the framework that you actually need to build your campaign around. Up first, we've got that decision to run, right? That feeling, that heartbeat in your chest of like, I know I need to do it. Securing your messaging. What are the things that you care about, your community cares about? How can you see yourself and see others in your community in the messaging you want to get into? Then we go into this whole construct of voter engagement. Finding that universe of voters, voter identification, identifying that they want to vote for you, persuading that you are the right candidate for the job, donor recruitment, how do I fund my campaign, GOTV, getting out the vote, and then last but not least, winning your election. So pre-campaign work, we're going to cover those foundations, establishing a win number, learning about your district, launching your campaign. We are absolutely not going to fuss over expensive polling data, crazy algorithms or models. Instead, we are going to look at how you can actually construct a solid foundation for your campaign's victory based on freely available public information. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jay to talk to us about a win number.
Yeah, so this is both like stunningly obvious and incredibly important to running a successful campaign. You need to know how many votes you have to get to win. That's all your win number is. And it's pretty simple to calculate, but obviously a really critical component of building a winning campaign. So It really boils down to the thing you would expect it to boil down to. It's 50% of the voters who will likely vote in the election plus one. That's all it is. You don't need a landslide to win. You just need that. So to get the information that allows you to calculate that with confidence, your first stop should be your local elections office, whatever that's called, Board of Elections, county clerk, and either in person or online. Some folks will provide this information to you virtually. And you'll want to get at least the results of the last 2 elections, but the last 3 are really ideal if you can get them. So in our example of Sally, she'll go to the Quincy election clerk, where she will file a request for the election results from the last 3 elections for District 5. And every district is made up of precincts. You probably know about these, but for folks who aren't familiar with the term or have kind of a hazy definition of it, it is just the atomic unit of politics. It's a small geographic boundary within a district, and they're typically the size of a neighborhood. Generally, which precinct you live in will determine where you vote and who you're eligible to vote for. So when Sally is requesting election results from the registrar, she will receive a grand total broken down by candidate, as well as the results broken down by precinct. Knowing which precincts are going to be the most active is essential for targeting as you are starting to identify potential supporters later on. Cool. So in this case, when Sally gets the results back, she sees that in 2018, 10,065 people turned out to vote. In 2020, 8,221 turned out. She also notes that in the 2019 election, somebody ran unopposed for the seat. Looking at that, you can sort of safely assume that 2019 is not going to represent what will happen in a year that there's a competitive election. So in this case, it probably makes sense for Sally to just throw those numbers out and focus on the 2 that actually were contested. So she's literally just going to average those, and that gives her a number of 9,143. So then there's a little simple math you can do. The 9,143 votes is the average total turnout. So that's like roughly what we expect to happen in this election cycle. And so if you literally just divide that, if you multiply that by 0.51, you would get the win number as we talked about it, 50 plus 1. But you want a little bit of a margin of error. Like 53 is just safer because it gives you a little bit of a cushion in case you underestimate turnout. So what we're going to do instead is multiply this number by 0.53, and that gives us 4,846. 4,846 voters turning out on election day to vote for Sally is what Sally is aiming for.
Awesome. So task ahead is clear, right? You know how many votes you're going to need to win on election day, but now you have to get your name on the ballot. So to do that, you're going to go back to that registrar's office, right, or the clerk's office, and request the paperwork to specifically file as a candidate. As you start to go into that, we need to think about your timeline. So what is the timeline between today or the day you actually officially decide to run and election day? From there, you want to calculate the number of days, weeks, and months. Within that, you want to add in all of your filing and reporting deadlines, any important holidays. These are things that your campaign needs to be aware of. So when you're creating that timeline, making sure to pop those in. Then you're going to take your win number and calculate how many supporters you'll need throughout your campaign to hit that specific turnout numbers. So what does that look like? Take our win number and divide it by the weeks you have left. This is the number of supporters you need per week in order to win your campaign. From that, we're going to be able to actually set weekly supporter goals based on the fact that you know you need 300 supporters each week. You need net new of 300. That's going to be able to give you goals and set up an infrastructure of why you're contacting people, how many people you're contacting, and how you're contacting them. So, Jay, I'm going to kick it to you to talk about the magic of budgeting.
So budgeting is possibly the least sexy part of building a campaign, but it is an incredibly important one because you will end up spending a lot of money in a hurry on things that don't matter if you're not thoughtful about it. So early on, you need to lay out a good budget, and that will help you identify what you actually need to raise to be able to run the campaign you want to run. So the first piece of that is finding out what previous elections in your district typically cost. And the way you can do that is return to the place where you filed for office and request financial information. All of it is publicly available. Campaigns have to disclose what they're raising and what they're spending. And you should be cognizant of that in running your own campaign, because you will ultimately have to report on this stuff yourself. So let's split it up into two parts. The first piece is operational costs. These are the material things that you need to run. And this should be about 20 to 30% of your budget. That includes office space. It includes utilities, software. Think your website, your communication tools, your fundraising tools, and capturing interactions with voters. Then voter persuasion costs are also a critically important piece that encompass all your forms of communication, anything associated with how you are going to reach out to people. Once you've completed your budget, you want to create a few scaled back versions. So you have a backup plan and shoestring options in case fundraising doesn't go the way you expect it to. It's really important to both think big and also give yourself realistic options, so that if fundraising is more challenging than you feared it would be, you still are able to operate and operate with a plan. And remember, it really is heavily reliant on fundraising. You have the budget that you are able to acquire for yourself by raising money from your supporters. So here's a representation of what that looks like in a NationBuilder context. If you were to log into the NationBuilder control panel and you want to see both money coming in and money you're paying out, this is sort of a typical view that you would be in day to day.
Yeah. And you really want to make sure when you're thinking about your campaign that you have set aside some way for you to track this, right? NationBuilder does provide that. If you can't afford that right now, think about a spreadsheet. Like, you do need to be able to track this. Okay, so now we're going into securing your messaging. We've discussed laying the foundations for your campaign, and now we want to think about your personal story, your why. The first question everyone's going to ask you, because I've asked of many candidates, why are you running? Why? Right? It's a big question to tackle. The goal of answering this question is not actually to talk about your policy issues or to give a stump speech. It's to emotionally connect with what drives you to serve and ultimately then be in public office. Before you get into any strategies of how you're going to bring about change, you first have to communicate why. Why are you running for office? Why should people vote for you? This is the heartbeat of your whole campaign. Honestly, your voters do not care about your resume. They really, really don't. And if they do, LinkedIn exists for a reason. They'll go and they'll stalk you, right? Just like know that that's a real thing that happens. So take time to learn about the voters in your area by talking and listening to them. This is how you're going to find out what issues are most important to the people you're asking to vote for you on election day. Find the allies that you have within your district and start to build deep and meaningful relationships with these people. Things like your local chamber of commerce, any business roundtables, any alumni groups that you're a part of, any church networks that you're a part of, those beacons of your community. If you have relationships with those already and you're an active member of community, those relationships are going to be extremely easy for you to develop and make the ask of them as you start to build out your story. Make sure that your key issues are a part of your story. This is not me telling you to make up things about yourself, but if there are key issues in your community that you can weave into naturally your story, that is going to be extremely compelling for your audience, for the voters who you're asking. So now let's talk through some tactics that you can actually use to do this. Is anyone familiar with the story of self, us, and now? Okay, I'm seeing some. Okay, all right. Well, good thing I'm going to tell you. So this is based on Marshall Ganz's work on public narrative at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this is a structure that I have used on all of my campaigns over the years, and one that I find works really well for both the candidate, but also for any staff or volunteers that you have. So when you're thinking about voter contact, don't just think about it in the lens of you reaching out, also think about it in the lens of your volunteers and your staff. So Gans breaks the public narrative into 3 pieces. Up first is the story of self. This is your call to leadership. Then there is the story of us, which is the shared values and experience in your community. Then lastly is the story of now. And this is where you actually get to have a call to action. This is, how do I lead someone towards strategy and action? So up first, we have the story of self. To tell your story of self, you actually are trying to enable other people to get you, right? That way they can experience the values that call you to serve and lead. The key is to focus on moments where your values led you to make the choices that you did. When did you first start to care about the issues you're talking about? What made you need to do something about this? When did you realize you had to run for office? Those are all questions to think about as you are sitting down and saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to run for office. What's my why? What is my story? What's relevant to tell people? And why am I doing it? Then you move into the story of us, right? So you've clearly articulated your story of self, that why you're called to lead. Now you can start to build out that story of, excuse me, the story of us. This enables your community to actually get each other, right? They are able to see the values that they share. This can ultimately inspire people to act together and do great things, like figuring out what it takes to get you elected. Important thing to note here, the us is actually less about a category that describes people like race or gender or language. Instead, it's actually about the values that they share and are rooted in a common experience. So think of things like a new school that is being built in your district. That is a common and shared experience. And you, as someone who's running for office, may have an opinion on that. That is something for you to like ground in and share that experience so your community can build around it. Last but not least is the story of now. So you've said why you're running for office, and we've gotten who is it that is going to join you. Now you can share that story of now. This is meant to communicate a sense of urgency, a call to action. This story is going to be rooted in the values that you celebrated in your stories of self and us. And your now should communicate the following. What is the urgent challenge that requires our collective action? What hope do we have that we can actually meet that challenge? What do we specifically need to do in order to act? And then finally, actually asking the community to join you in support. Like with all things, develop several versions of your story. And I don't mean different, like actual stories, again, not made up, all truthful, please. But what I'm saying here is different versions. Know your audience. When you are talking to a elderly home, you don't necessarily want to be talking about the new school. You want to be talking about things that are relevant to those individuals and where your story aligns with it. So make sure you have those different versions ready. And practice. If you cannot do this in front of your friends and family, you are not ready to do it in front of 500 people that don't know you. Those people will give you honest feedback, take it, and use it to develop your story and build on that infrastructure of self, us, and now. Okay, so I'm going to just like have a little moment. We've been talking for 30 minutes. How is everyone doing? Is this landing? Are you excited? I can see there are things in the chat. I'm going to look at the chat. Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up. This is recorded, so go. Okay, awesome. Okay, so find your universe. We've talked about win numbers, getting your name on the ballot, telling your story. Now it's actually time to start finding the people who are going to vote for you. The best place to start finding voters in your district is your voter file. A voter file is a list of the registered voters in your district. And you can request this information for free from NationBuilder, or you can go to your county clerk's office. Sometimes that will have a cost affiliated with it. It's going to be one of the best assets of your entire campaign. The voter file contains basic information like name, address, and some states include phone numbers and email addresses. However, do not email them. People don't like that. It's not fun. Anyhow, the most valuable piece of information, though, in this is your vote history. Your vote history doesn't show who someone voted for, but it does show if a voter cast a ballot in an election and how that ballot was actually cast. So, for example, excuse me, a voter file might show that a person named John Rochford voted in the 2020 presidential election via mail-in ballot, but it won't show you which candidate he supported. Knowing how to interpret and use this information is essential. Many registered voters don't turn out to vote or don't vote very often, most just for presidential elections every 4 years. So the number of participants in an election gets lower and lower the further down the ballot, so municipal races, that you are. All right, Jay, take us away.
So backing up for a moment to the instant that you're really starting to map out your campaign, a really important thing to answer is the question, who are you focusing on? Who are the people you need to persuade? Who are the people you need to motivate? And the voter file is a really important way of getting at that in a macro sense. But there's also a more basic sense that's important, which is getting an understanding of where you're strong, what your sort of natural appeal is, and where you have work to do. So that actually starts on a personal level. And it's about seeking guidance from people you trust, the people who make up your kitchen cabinet. That might be family, that might be friends, it might be political mentors, it might be people you're involved in social clubs with. Whoever those people are whose judgment you trust, starting out by working with them to pull together a list of supporters at the beginning of your campaign is really important. And when I say a list of supporters, I don't just mean abstract categories of folks. I mean literal individual humans. When you've done that and really done an exhaustive job of that, look at it and see what trends emerge. That can be really helpful in understanding what target universes you are going to ultimately focus on in campaigning. And keep in mind that the best use of your time and your effort is in people who have a strong likelihood of turning out to vote. If you know that a group of people is like significantly less motivated to turn out, that's not your first priority. Your first priority is making sure that you're winning the support of the people who will. So, how do you actually make the voter file come to life? Finding your universe is great, but when your universe is just a list of names living in a spreadsheet, it's not really helping you. And if your supporter information lives in a bunch of fragmented systems like a donor database, a Google Doc or an Excel spreadsheet, a paper attendee sheet from an event, it is very hard to get a full picture of your people. So it is massively important to have a single source of truth that you can rely on. What you're seeing here is an example of how this works in the NationBuilder context. And ideally, all the information about your supporters, whatever system you're using, lives in a database that puts people at the center and allows you to understand who those supporters truly are. So take a look at Ruth's profile here in a NationBuilder database. We can tell quite a lot about her by just looking at the screenshot. So we know that she is an amazing volunteer. We know she's donated quite a bit of money to the campaign. And perhaps most importantly, because it indicates leadership potential, she's recruited a couple of folks in her network to join the campaign's efforts as well. We can also tell that she is a strong supporter and that she's not affiliated with any particular party. So, how does that actually work when you're talking to voters, Sorcha?
That brings us into voter identification. And so, what this is actually a conversation type. This is a beat, right? If we think back to that campaign arc. And this is a conversation with registered voters to identify their level of support for you or lack thereof. That's just as important. And voter data can tell you whether a person is likely to vote and sometimes their party affiliation. But the only way you're actually going to know if they'll vote is if you ask them. So, someone from your campaign should speak to each voter, telling them a little bit about you, your positions on the issue, and then asking them which candidate they support. It's really, really important for your team and yourself as the candidate to understand that ID conversations are actually not about convincing someone. This is not that moment. That will come later on. The goal of an ID conversation is to ID, right? So after these conversations are complete, you're going to have a count of exactly how many voters support you, which voters are opposed, and then who is undecided. So, in thinking about your voter identification component of your campaign, there are a number of contact methods that you're going to use to have these types of conversation. Now that we are getting kind of to a point of outside of COVID, we can get back to door knocking. We can think about actually going back and engaging with folks like that. Phone banks are also a really fantastic way to do this at scale and communicating with people. Mass communication, social media, less helpful, but also a way in which you can do it. It just has to be very targeted. On all the campaigns I have worked on over the years, it surprises every time we call a voter on the fifth time and they say things like, "Well, I'm sorry, who's Sally?" And I'm looking at my spreadsheet and I'm like, "But I've called you 5 times. This is okay, cool. You just didn't hear." That's normal. People have other stuff. They have lives, they have children, they have parents, they have other things happening, and your campaign is not going to be the first thing on their mind. With that in mind, you need to speak to your voters at least 7 times. It sounds like a lot, but it is very important, especially when you are trying to understand, how do I hit my win number, right? We need to get that number. So you have to contact those voters and confirm with them. Make sure you are keeping track of every data point you acquire during these conversations. In particular, you need to be recording your voter support on a scale of 1 through 5. So let me show you what it actually looks like to keep track of that. So here you can see a record where you are able to identify a scale of 1 through 5. So 1 being that strong support, 2 weak support, 3 undecided, 4 weak oppose, and 5 strong oppose. This is going to give you a definition basically of where someone actually is on that scale. And then how are you going to communicate with them moving forward now that you've identified where they are on that 1 through 5? It helps streamline your campaign because everyone knows who you're speaking to, when they were last contacted, and what their support status is. So now you've done your due diligence, you've recorded in real time where someone actually falls on that scale of 1 through 5. How do we think about tailoring our conversations for folks? For example, your talk track should look extremely different from when you're in a conversation with someone who is undecided versus someone who is weak support. And we're going to talk about that now as we jump into voter persuasion.
Yeah, so voter persuasion is kind of the next phase of your engagement with folks. And as is probably like self-evident, you don't want to spend any time on the people who don't support you. Like, they've made up their minds, and you'll burn calories that won't actually pay off if you invest any more time in them. So the 4s and the 5s, put them to the side. But what about your undecided voters, the 3s? Persuasion conversations are exactly what they sound like. They're intended to ultimately sway undecided voters to come your way. And it's about focusing on the issues that are the most important to those voters. It is about making sure they understand where your candidate stands and how your candidate's values and views align with theirs. And it's about asking them for their support. So the conversation tends to be educational in nature, and it's really where you use your story to connect with those voters. So keep in mind always, you'll start to take it for granted because you've told it a million times. But supporters will always want to know your story. It is so important that they are equipped to talk about it, whether that's staff or volunteers. They need to know how to tell your story through the self, us, and now lens. This is also your chance to leverage the data you've collected and convert people who've never heard of you into supporters. The story is a really, really powerful mechanism for doing that. And those conversations should focus heavily on the universe of voters who are still undecided. So, what you want to do is allow your supporters the opportunity to connect their own story to yours so the campaign truly feels personal and human. It is ultimately about putting people at the center, and an individual story of why they support you is going to be really powerful and motivating others to follow in their footsteps. It sounds like a lot of one-to-one work at a glance, but there's a way to do it and do it effectively at a much larger scale. So this is where we come back to the benefits of working within one system that centralizes data and all of these different functions. It is all about the ability to leverage everything you understand and have learned about an individual person. And I'll say, like, data is a sort of fixation for a lot of folks in politics, but collecting data for its own sake isn't actually useful. It's really all about what you do with that data and your intentions for it. So you want to be able to reliably segment the universe of folks you've engaged with based on what they care about, based on the history of their interactions with you, based on their level of investment or lack of investment in your cause. All of that matters. So you can see here how this works in NationBuilder. The whole premise is making it easy to filter and segment based on the data you've collected. And in this particular example, we're looking for all of our supporters who've recently attended one of our events. We're then cutting turf to actually hand off walk sheets to canvassers who are going to go out and engage voters directly. So in this example here, we're using some dynamic data to craft personalized outreach to supporters. So you can see that in the email that we're sending to Janie Owen, reminding her that there's a barbecue this Saturday, we are surfacing name, we're surfacing neighborhood, and we're also showing off to the left how you can use texting to drive even better turnout. Research shows that text open rates are actually as high as 98%. By comparison, email open rates are about 20%. So texting is an extraordinarily effective mechanism for reaching folks if you can get a mobile number opt-in to communicate with them. And on average, it takes about 90 seconds for someone to respond to a text versus 90 minutes to respond to an email. So it is important to mix up your medium of communication. And ultimately, the goal of all of it is to recruit more supporters and to persuade them to vote for you and to open up channels of communication for other forms of engagement as you continue down the line. Remember, multiple touches over the course of a campaign are critical in everything you are trying to do. Obviously, one of the big things that you are trying to encourage supporters to do is not just contribute their time and their votes, but to contribute their money, which is where I kick it back over to Sorcha.
Oh yeah, donor recruitment. So fundraising, this is a key component of your campaign. And as the candidate, you will need to be making fundraising asks of your nearest and dearest before actually spreading out into a wider pool of voters. None of the candidates that I've worked with over the years have particularly enjoyed call time, but it is an absolute must. When you are driving from event A to event B, get call time on the books so that you can actually give your campaign the money it needs for mailers and digital ads or radio ads or AC if you're running in the New England area in the summertime. You need AC in that office because it's going to be gross. So donor recruitment. You have found people who are your supporters. So start thinking about folks who can now become donors. Separate out people who could become fundraisers versus people who can actually be small dollar donors. You want to use a combination of digital and on the ground touch points. Think small dollar online versus large dollar would be maybe an in-person event. Employ strategies like peer-to-peer fundraising. So today's webinar is focused on learning how to run for office, but we've got a number of other courses here at NationBuilder that you can take to understand more in depth about what it means to run a peer-to-peer fundraising program. The other thing here is to actually, how do you start to think about how do you use your digital infrastructure to ensure you are able to kind of get the most bang for your buck when you are running a campaign online. So we're coming back to Andrew Yang's campaign, and this was on his NationBuilder website. The thing that's important to note here was you weren't able to access his main website without going through this page. So you had to physically go in and exit. It was very clear that from Andrew Yang's perspective, it was really important at this moment in time for him to actually get donation dollars. So there's no other way for folks to engage without having actually to bypass this page. The other thing to think about here is the different donation amounts that you're seeing on the page. 35, 75, 100, 250, 500. Those are all customizable. So maybe your audience actually might respond better if that's $2, $5, $10, $12. Know that about your audience and test it, right? Change this up, have a couple of different donation pages that allow you to see the flexibility, because at the end of the day, people are going to do what you're asking of them. And so if the lowest donation amount is actually a barrier to entry, you might be turning away donors who could actually give you something. The last piece to think about here is fundraisers. And so specifically allowing people to feel responsible for your campaign by fundraising on your behalf. Identify those folks early and ask them, can you fundraise $5,000? Can you fundraise $10,000? When you're thinking about those folks, maybe there are kind of two options that I see very clearly. One is someone who has a large influence and a large footprint that may not actually be able to donate themselves. So think college students that are TikTok famous, right? They have a large audience that they can speak to on your behalf. Others may be well-connected folks in the community that have, have the ability to fundraise and also donate to your campaign. So be intentional when you are thinking about the different types of donors and fundraisers for your campaign. All right. Last area of our voter communication is get out the vote, Jay.
Yeah. So this is the fun part. It's also the part where you'll probably eat way too much fast food. You won't sleep. Like it is truly intense, but it's exciting because this is the phase where you know who your supporters are. If you've done a good job of identifying supporters and persuasion, you know exactly who you need to focus on to ensure that they turn out. And it's all about just motivating them and helping them to get to the polling places and place a vote for you. So this generally will take place in the last week of the election, but it is worth noting that absentee ballots can sometimes be an important factor. And if they are, you'll likely want to do an absentee ballot push that's similar to this starting earlier on as well. So it is all about locking in your GOTV universe. And what I mean by that is you only want to be communicating with ones and twos. At this point, there is no more persuasion to do it. It's just pure motivation. So it's critical that during those first two phases, you have identified enough ones and twos that you actually can hit your win number. And now, if you've done that, it's just all about getting them to turn out. So all your staff and your volunteers should be contacting voters to confirm that they have a voting plan, confirm that they know where their polling location is or their closest ballot drop box, confirm that they know vote by mail deadlines if you are doing an absentee ballot chase. And you truly do want to be really hyper targeted in how you're spending your time and effort. So even within that ones and twos universe, the people you really should prioritize the most are the ones who are less likely to vote. You'll know that based on vote history and the voter file. People who have a bit of a shaky record of turning out but are supportive of you, those are the ones you really, really want to drive things home with. And potentially it's even finding people who will drive somebody to the polls. Like you might want to make it as easy as that for them. So it's all about not duplicating efforts. And what that means is being really, really precise about your data. Your volunteers and your staff want to help you win. So your data needs to aid in that effort, not hinder them. A representative example, let's say at your Saturday phone bank, a voter confirmed their plan to vote with a volunteer. Great, they should be in your third or fourth round of election day lists, not the first ones, because you know they've already come up with a coherent strategy for themselves for how they're going to turn out. And your ones and twos have to have a plan to vote. I really can't emphasize how important that is. Your campaign also should be equipped to easily share the information about voting with them, not just via a direct phone call, but potentially over text message, over email on your website. Better yet, some combination of multiple or all of the above. And when you've been gathering invaluable data during your ID and persuasion phases on a voter's contact history, listen to that data. So if somebody's phone was inaccessible during persuasion, don't put them in the call audience for GOTV. Focus on communicating with people you know you can reach via channels you know that you can reach them to. It's also important to identify clusters of voters that you can communicate with. So a really good tactic, for example, is let's say 8 to 11 a.m. Contact age 65 plus voters. Just focus in on a universe who you're going to contact at the same time. Then maybe 12 to 4 p.m. You're calling voters you've identified as stay-at-home parents who work night shifts. Your 5s or your 5 p.m. block. Maybe you're calling voters who you've identified as working a 9-to-5 job. So, you know, they're less likely to be at work during the time you're contacting them. The more information you have to be really thoughtful about who you're contacting when, the better off you're going to be. So what does it actually look like to get folks to make a plan to vote?
It's actually easier than a lot of people think. So Getting your universe of supporters to make their own plan to vote actually increases the likelihood of a supporter voting by 10%. By making a plan and thinking through the specifics of when, how, where, who are they going to vote for, they're making a psychological commitment, and in turn, they're actually more likely to go out to the polls. It also gives you, as the campaign, an opportunity to collect information of how, when they will vote. So you can actually share this with them as a reminder and a follow up to find out if they did vote in how they self prescribed that they were going to. Lastly, it also gives you an opportunity to acquire new supporters by getting existing supporters to share their voting plans with friends and family. This is one of my favorite things. This is an organic recruitment method. As you're coming up into those last 2 to 3 weeks of your campaign, getting your supporters to share their plan to vote with their friends and family, making it fun, making it an action that people want to do, that they want to share, giving people little graphics that they can share on social media, make it exciting. So, in thinking about that, we are thinking about the different ways that you're actually going to connect with your voters throughout GOTV. Phone banking. Jay just ran through kind of a specific outline of what you can do throughout your phone banking sessions, but be intentional with them and make sure you are listening to the data you've collected. Social media. Think about Facebook Live, Instagram Live, TikTok, ways that you can be in front of voters throughout that period so that they know who you are. Remember what I said earlier, folks have other lives. You need to be in front of them if you want them to vote for you. Video calls, doing Zoom, doing a air meet or a hop in, things like that, ways that people can come into you. Literature drops. So literature drops, think you every day when it's a campaign season, you get a door hanger or a little flyer. Those are great ways for folks to know who you are. Text blasts, email blasts, all great ways to communicate with folks during this period. Robocalls is an interesting one. I recommend that you get someone who is famous or a community leader to actually do a robocall the week before the election if they are endorsing you out to a key target audience. And last but not least is direct mail. There's a number of different strategies you can employ, but you definitely want to be thinking about direct mail as it comes into GOTV, thinking specifically about polling location information. Up next, ad types. So there are multiple mediums that you can spread your ad buy budget across. Most common ad platforms used in the political space: Facebook, Twitter, Google Ads, Google Paid Search. Each of these mediums have different technical requirements for ad creative, spend, and length. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your current social assets to understand which medium will have the largest impact for you on the audience that you can engage with. When you're creating your content strategy, it's going to be really important to identify the key message for each platform. So Facebook is definitely best for acquisitions and calls to actions. Twitter, better for education or news updates. And Google Ads is looking specifically for brand awareness and campaign awareness. In each of these, you need to have a clear call to action, give people a reason to share, and always listen to the data, or else it's a waste of your money. Last but not least, you need to be agile. Track when your voters have actually voted. Do not call someone who said they were voting in the morning, in the afternoon, phone bank. Listen to your voters. Remove people from your list. Make sure that you are constantly updating what your voter contact lists are. And respect consent. If someone said they do not want to be contacted on election day, don't do it, because it's just going to make them mad at you, okay? Respect it and be agile. Election day run of show. So polls open. You need to make sure you know specifically when your polls are open. Your candidate schedule needs to be bulletproof. There needs to be toilet breaks. There needs to be phone breaks. There needs to be, how long is it going to take for me to get from A to B? Where are news outlets going to be that you can make sure that you plant your candidate in those specific locations? You also want to make sure that you have phone bank times so that volunteers can select and say, actually, the 2 p.m. slot works for me, or the 5 p.m. slot works for me. In that, you want to have list refresh time. So we've spent 5 hours this morning calling the 65 plus audience. We want to make sure we refresh it. We update that data to say, okay, we've actually gotten through 300 of the 1,000. Now we have 700 less, right? Make sure those refresh times are in there. Poll watcher sheet pickup time. So when you're thinking about sending volunteers out to the polls, you are allowed as a campaign to have poll watchers that can go in and specifically watch in the polls to see your voters that are coming through. If folks have specific questions about a poll watcher campaign, you all have my email. Please feel free to reach out. Voter turnout check. So this is to get a benchmark of how is voter turnout going. You can go into the polling location and you can just ask one of the poll workers to tell you what the voter count is at. That is, you're allowed to get that information, and make sure you're doing this, thinking about your win number. This all tracks back to your voter contact and outreach. Data entry blocks. You need to be getting the data back in for the work the volunteers are doing on the ground. And last but not least, signs do not vote, but they are fun on election day. And if people want to hold signs, let them hold a sign and find a place to do so. There are rules and regulations around how the distance you have to be from a polling location, and that varies municipality to municipality. So make sure you check that beforehand, but get a viz schedule for people that want to participate in your campaign. The last thing we're going to touch on in 1 minute, so we have 2 minutes for questions, is digital infrastructure. Jay.
Lightning round. Yeah. So we're a technology provider. We obviously have a lot of thoughts and opinions about this, but I think 2 really important principles. Number 1, tech is not a crutch, and it is not a substitute for a good campaign strategy. It's a supplement to it. Number 2, technology should make campaigning easier. It should not make it more onerous. It should not make it harder. So let's talk about what non-negotiables you need to have in place technologically. You need a website that is professional and that drives action. You need a supporter database or a CRM, tools for actually understanding your relationship with your supporters. You need voter data. If you're running for office, you got to know the voters who you're trying to persuade and turn out. You need segmentation and mapping tools. You need to be able to target your outreach and contact those voters. You need mass communication tools. Email is a must. Texting is extremely important too. And you need software to support your fundraising efforts. Some less essential, like bedrock things, but things that are important and make a difference. More sophisticated canvassing technology so that you can record interactions with voters in person at their door in a means other than pen and paper. Phone banking technology for making calls to voters and recording their responses to questions. Data analytics tools, data enhancements. This is like, what a lot of folks would refer to as appends that'll come from firms that specialize in this work. And tools for peer-to-peer fundraising, so you can get beyond just your straight ahead fundraising efforts into getting your supporters raising money for you.